This is the follow-up page from this program. So after Dave's presentation, you can go to this page, not right away. It's going to take an hour or two for the video to process, and then we'll get it loaded up there. But that's where you'll find this program recorded, as well as other supportive information, also Dave's contact information and that sort of thing if you'd like to know more about Dave. I'll tell you about Dave in just a second. I also just like to remind folks that we do also host a parent support meeting every Wednesday night. That is not a webinar style, that's a Zoom meeting style, so that we can all see each other unless you choose not to be seen. But we meet every Wednesday night at 7. We normally meet in Hatboro every Wednesday and Thursday at 7, but obviously we can't be in person, so here we are on Wednesdays. It's a wonderful group of family members that just share our experience and what might be helpful to others. This is our program next week. I'm so excited about this. We've been wanting to address this topic for some time. We know that people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, or asexual are at a higher risk for substance use disorders. So we're going to be taking a look at that with some really amazing panelists. I hope you'll join us for that program. Big thank you to the Montgomery County Office of Drug and Alcohol. They have helped to support these programs that we've taken online, and we partner with them in many other ways. So giant thank you to them. So here we are talking about vaping, nicotine, and marijuana. So our presenter tonight is Dave Fialco. I'll just tell you a little bit about him. He has a wealth of knowledge on the subject of vaping, nicotine, and marijuana. He's an internationally certified prevention specialist with the Council of Southeast Pennsylvania. He's also a nationally certified tobacco treatment specialist and a commissioned FDA officer. Dave has more than 19 years experience working in the drug and alcohol and mental health fields, working in treatment, prevention, tobacco cessation, and enforcement. So without further ado, Dave, would you like to take it away?
Absolutely. All right. Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you for the invite to address your constituents here. A big fan, be part of the conversation, have been a fan for many years. So it's great. I was just having a conversation with somebody the other night about the traveling bedroom that you often rally to make an appearance at various functions. And so your name comes up quite often in the conversation.
Just to be clear, mock teen bedroom, traveling bedroom sounds a little nefarious.
Yes, it does. Thank you. The mock teen bedroom.
It's a presentation where we show what some signs might be of some substance use in a typical teenager's bedroom. Hopefully it's not too typical because we have an awful lot of warning signs there. So,
but yeah, so if nobody's ever gotten to see the mock teen bedroom trailer, it's definitely eye-opening. I highly recommend it. All right. With that said, you know, my job duties nowadays are all remote. So I think, you know, we're all learning to navigate this new way of learning and educating. Hopefully it'll be over soon. We're, you know, fingers crossed. I think here in Bucks County, we're scheduled for like the 27th of this month to go green. But anyway, in the meantime, we can use this opportunity to increase our knowledge as parents, as professionals in the fields, to clear the air, per se, I guess, on topics such as vaping, nicotine, and cannabis. You know, since this has happened, we really haven't provided any cessation services. One of the things, one of the job duties that I provide at the Council of Southeast Pennsylvania, which is the agency that I work for, is providing cessation services or quitting nicotine products. And we typically do that throughout the year whenever the opportunity allows us to engage. We traditionally do group format. We approach it with moving a person from, you know, pre-contemplation where they don't see it as a problem. So if that's the issue with that individual, or our goal with that individual is to move them to contemplation, where they might have some concerns, you know, say, hey, I never looked at it that way. Yeah, maybe it is time I start to, you know, cut down. Great, that's a great starting place. And then we move through the planning and the action, and so cessation is a great tool. We'll touch on some of the techniques very briefly at the end of this. You know, unfortunately right now, you know, we're seeing a large number of new users when it comes to nicotine, not smoking, but nicotine, which is vaping. And then cannabis, of course. You know, we live in a medicinal state. Act 16 allows for the use of marijuana. So we'll be talking about that and, you know, why it's broadly accepted. Is there medical potential? Absolutely. Most of our medicine comes from plants. It's just we need to educate ourselves so that we can risk and benefit, you know, calculate the risk and benefit as far as if that's something that would fit the diagnosis that, you know, if you are yourself contemplating using medicinal cannabis, you know, that's something that you and a medical team should have a conversation about. So that's, again, we'll talk about that. And then we'll also talk about the recreational use of it as well and why there's concerns there. My ability to provide this you know, be part of the conversation, my time is funded through the Health Promotion Council, and they're located in Philadelphia. So they fund all of our cessation services and tobacco education services, as well as our, you know, our enforcement and regulatory duties to make sure that retailers are, you know, not selling to minors. So big shout out to the Health Promotion Council. And this is my agency, the Council of Southeast Pennsylvania. If you never visited our website, I encourage you to do so. We are a nonprofit, and we offer prevention, intervention, and addiction recovery solutions. That's our tagline. We have SAP programs, DUI programs, prevention programs, family programs. You know, if you haven't visited our website, visit there, check it out. You know, if you're in Bucks County and you're watching this in Montgomery County, Bucks County Drug and Alcohol Commission is another funder who funds a lot of our programs, and they're kind of like a one-stop shop, similar to your Montgomery County Drug and Alcohol Commission. You know, you can always log on to those websites for resources. So with that, because I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and we're going to squeeze this in under an hour here. A lot of information. I do talk fast. So we can, you know, we will have time at the end for questions. All right. I don't have my chat box up there, but Kim, if you see something that pops up that seems relevant, feel free to interrupt me and ask a question. You know, say somebody's got a question about this. If maybe you can, you know, go into further detail about that.
Great. I'll do that. Thanks, Dave.
No problem. So, you know, otherwise we'll just wait till the end if there's no pressing issues. So, you know, what is the attraction with ATOD? Alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. You know, I'd like to see that change to ANOD, alcohol, nicotine, and other drugs, because, you know, tobacco is kind of, you know, it's a dying drug, really, up until very recently. Now it's rebounding, but it's because of vaping that we're starting to see an increase in reported new users of tobacco. So really, that should be changed to nicotine. Maybe I'll start the trend on that, right? But what are the risk factors? Access, purity, and perceived level of harm. And right now, we have access to illicit as well as legal or illegal drugs. Illicit being illegal, easier than ever before. I'm a product. I was in high school in the 80s. You know, the worst things I really had to say no to in the 80s was, you know, very low grade cannabis and alcohol, you know, and tobacco. Didn't do so great at tobacco. I was a smoker in the 80s, and I partook in nicotine and the smoking, the designated student smoking sections in the high school where you could smoke with your teachers. But the access for nicotine for tobacco back then was very, very easy. And if you could reach the counter, you could purchase a pack of cigarettes. My father was a smoker, you know, neighbors were smokers. The data for back in the 80s of smokers, if you look at the national data, it was around 37% of the population smoked. But where I grew up in Northeast Jersey, I would say it was probably closer to 70 to 75% of the population were smokers. So if you could reach the counter, you could buy a pack of cigarettes for about $1. And access, you know, if you can get it easily, the chances that you're going to experiment with it is higher. Purity, yeah, tobacco was a little different back then. We had very tricky sales. You know, even light cigarettes weren't light. They just had holes in the filter. and to let more air in as you're drawing on it. But the problem with that, the reason why they outlawed or they banned light cigarettes is because when you grasp the filter, your fingers cover up those holes and you think you're getting less nicotine and tobacco and tar and carcinogens, but you're getting the same amount because those holes are now covered up by your fingers. So the tobacco was actually pure. The products were stronger and less regulated back then. Access was high and perceived level of harm was very low. We did not have any assemblies on smoking or, risks. We had a student smoking section. You could go out, I could go out and smoke with a teacher if I wanted to and bum a cigarette. So the perceived level of harm was very low. When you combine those three things, use is always high. When you look at cannabis from my region in the 80s, we had a high perceived level of harm. We looked at it as, hey, the Reagans were in office, just say no to drugs, man, drugs are bad. We had a high perceived level of harm of cannabis, or marijuana as we called it. Access was difficult. I was not aware of any drug dealers in my high school. And I'm pretty sure that I ran with enough of a broad group of friends that if there was one in our school, I would have heard about it. So people had to plan a day in advance to access their drug of choice, whether it be alcohol or cannabis or whatever it was. And so that gave us time to think about it. A, really, do we want to do this? B, how's my dad's foot going to feel across my rear? And it allowed for thinking and processing because our prefrontal cortexes weren't fully developed. Kind of gave that time to think. So access was difficult. Purity was low. And perceived level of harm was high. So in the 80s, since 70s were kind of an interesting time, but the 80s, if you're in high school in the 80s and you're a parent now and you're saying, well, I might have experimented with this or that or the other thing, and I may even done a little more than experiment, and I turned out okay. It's not the same. It's completely different. Completely different. And that's really one of the important messages that I want to get across. Just because previous generations may have engaged in similar behaviors, the environment and the outcomes are not the same. One of the things I often get asked is, what promotes ATOD? Why is it in advantage, type settings, high socioeconomic setting, environments, where the elite live, right? You don't see the problems there, not in my backyard, but always see the problems in the lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. It's not true at all. All right. The most disadvantaged neighborhoods have the most visible drug problems. And that's what that is. In the disadvantaged neighborhoods, you can see it. It's out there. It's on the corners. It's there. In the privileged neighborhoods, it's there just in the same numbers. It's exactly same rate of use, same ease of access. It's just not in the open. And so there's this great lack of false a false sense of security for individuals who may live in that upper socioeconomic bracket. And so they may not be on their toes as much. The families in those disadvantaged neighborhoods, they're aware that it's visible. And so they're working overtime to increase, family communication, making sure the child feels safe at home. They have very clear boundaries and expectations. And, they try to surround themselves and their children with healthy adult and parental role models. And they try to avoid those antisocial role models, but it's challenging. So, in those disadvantaged neighborhoods, the cards are stacked against them, but, you see success story after success story coming out of those neighborhoods where in the upper socioeconomic, bracket, you'll see, success and unsuccess in the same numbers. So don't feel safe if you live in a nice neighborhood. All right. Drugs are there. They're just not visible. And so it's our job to make sure that our youth, our children, our adolescents feel safe enough to have open communication with us, right? Be part of the conversation, you know, and feel safe in school as well. All right. Have very clear boundaries and expectations, and, you know, be a role model. You know, I'm not saying you can't drink alcohol. I'm not saying you can't have a glass of wine, you know, in front of your children. Just don't get blasted. Don't get drunk. You know, model responsible, you know, behaviors. You know, alcohol is titratable. You can have a glass of wine and not, you know, and be responsible. You know, yeah, other drugs are not titratable. By titration, I mean dose response. You take a little and you have a little response. That's alcohol. You have a little response. You have a little more, you have a little more response. You have a little more, you have a little more response. Cannabis is non-titratable, really, today's cannabis. It's a little bit and boom, a lot of response. And so people are like, you can use cannabis responsibly. I dare to argue. It's not the same. It's not the potency of my generation or previous generations, and we'll get to that. So really, nicotine, I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between nicotine and cannabis throughout this. But nicotine, what's the attraction? Smokers. Why did I smoke? Because it was a stimulant and it made me feel good. It allowed me to feel uplifted, focused, energized. And what's the number one reason that people smoke? Feel less stressed. And if we can think back to our adolescence, we were stressed. Social anxiety. I was an awkward kid. And I looked normal on the outside, and, you know, but inside I felt like everybody was looking at me when I walked into the room, right? As many of us do. That's the amygdala part of the brain. So we want to feel less stressed. And that's the number one reason that people smoke. 80% of smokers do it primarily to self-medicate emotional problems. They're using it the same way as antidepressants or tranquilizers, all right? And it's, up until recently, it's been very socially accepted. You know, you weren't blacklisted. Now, you know, no, not, you know, hey, you're not going to smoke that in here. Oh, you got to go outside and down the street, you know, 20 feet from the front door. Oh, you're one of those people who smoke? So we're seeing fewer and fewer people starting smoking and more actually quitting, which is fantastic. But unfortunately, they're getting a lot of misinformation, and they're just moving to another form of nicotine as harm reduction. But 3/4 of people with a history of depression become depressed when they try to quit. So we have a lot of people quitting right now. But if an individual has a history of depression, it's really, you know, it would behoove them to reach out to a trained individual who can assist them in cessation by using nicotine replacement therapies, so that they can transition without episodes of depression or generalized anxiety or anything like that, which may end up sending them to seek out, you know, prescription medication to help deal with those. So, you know, individuals like myself, you know, certified, you know, tobacco, you know, cessation treatment, certified tobacco treatment specialist, we can help individuals understand what's going on, as well as recommend the best route of nicotine replacement therapy. So, you know, months or years after giving up, you know, individuals still crave nicotine, because the same way that, you know, any drug, your brain, once it gets kind of that taste for it, it remembers it. And we'll get into that. Nicotine has a profound beneficial effect on the emotional state of people who could benefit from psychotropic medication. Absolutely. When I first got my start in this field, I worked in a partial program for schizoaffective, schizophrenic disorders, adults. And I would say probably in the neighborhood of 90% of the individuals who were in that program as clients or consumers, as we called them, smoked. Why? Because it worked. It works. It goes hand in hand with their psychotropic medication, and it makes them feel less stressed, and it improves their mood, and it allows them to kind of feel more focused in their treatment, in their partial programs. And for them, it seems to work even more effective than somebody who does not have those that mental health diagnosis, right? So, you know, it improves concentration and performance. If we think back to workplaces, maybe a cubicle, maybe somebody in here had a job in a cubicle in the 80s. And if you did, a lot of people smoked. You had the ashtray on the table, you had your cigarette, and you had your word processor, and you had deadlines, you had, you know, TPS reports, you had all kinds of reports to get done by the end of the day. Deadlines, pressure, right? And you worked in a cubicle, no ambient light, stale air, no social interaction, just focus. You had to maintain focus. So what did you need? You needed a stimulant, and you needed something that improved your mood. Smoking was that. It allowed you to increase your workload and your productivity, as well as improve your mood. So smokers in that setting were like, this is great, all's good, I can do this all day long. And they would smoke. Non-smokers in the cubicle next to them were stressed out, unhappy, and not as productive. So in the 80s, smokers were more productive than non-smokers. Then Clean Indoor Air Act happened, and all of a sudden now the smokers had to go down 4 flights of stairs to this designated smoking section and smoke outside, and then come back inside, and where that improved mood and focus would only last for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then for the remainder of that hour they were unproductive, grouchy, and, you know, unhappy. So smokers now became liabilities to employers, whereas the non-smoker was still at the same level, but now they're more productive than the smokers. So it only improves concentration and performance for short periods of time after exposure to the drug. Highly addictive, distributed quickly through the bloodstream. Within 4 to 6 seconds, it finds its way to the brain, the nicotinoid receptors. It increases the dopamine, or our body's natural happy drug, as it's been labeled. You know, it makes us happy. We are dopamine-seeking individuals, but it's kind of more of a cocktail. We've got lots of different endorphins and neurotransmitters that play a role in this cocktail, but everybody knows dopamine. And it's easy to kind of use it because it is the main one in that cocktail. But we'll get to that as far as how it, you know, and what levels it increases by, as well as, you know, what that looks like in the brain and why that is the addictive hook in nicotine. So this is what's called motivational salience, all right? Basically, you know, this is taking a look at an area in the brain called the limbic system, or as we also call it, the emotional brain. It's where a lot of our emotions and our who we are processed. It's a very small portion of the brain, but it's the part of the brain that, you know, makes humankind humankind. It's what differentiates us between, you know, a squirrel and us. We have this amazing region of the brain that has, you know, how do you say, with, you know, without offending anybody, evolved over, you know, thousands and thousands of years. So when we look at how this this region of the brain works, it is centered really around dopamine. It also is, like I said, it's a cocktail of glutamine and dopamine, as well as this other drug called GABA, and I'll explain real briefly what all those do. But when we engage in things that make us happy, the initial drug that we get, our brain manufactures dopamine, is dopamine. So when we engage in a good conversation or listen to a good joke, you know, and we laugh, that's a small dose of dopamine that's manufactured in our brain. And it's manufactured in what's called the ventral tegmental area, or as we call it, the VTA. And the nucleus accumbens is kind of where it goes to, all right? And when it lands there, we get a positive response, all right? Now, the thing is in order for dopamine to be manufactured, we have to engage in things that require skill and effort. So when we're looking at skill and effort, it varies, all right? There's variance with skill and effort. So video games, okay, it takes a little bit of skill and effort, right? Dexterity, it takes concentration, and you get a small dose of dopamine that lasts for a few seconds and then it's gone. So are video games addictive? When abused and misused, sure, it's called process addictions, where you're kind of tweaking and you're overusing this natural production of dopamine to a point where it interferes with other functions of your life. It's the same as sex or gambling or pornography or whatever it is that you're engaging in to get this natural level of dopamine that is a very small dose, lasts a few seconds, and then it's gone. That's still how would you say, you know, an addiction, or we call them process addictions, because you can't really use the word substance use disorder because it's not a substance, it's a process. So when we look at natural dopamine response, having a conversation with a good friend, a joke, 5% increase in dopamine, right? It's there, it's gone, you want it again, you look up at the brain, you're like, brain, hook me up some more. That brain's like, no, it's free. Go back out there and do that again. So you re-engage in that conversation in order to get some more dopamine. Now you find something else about that person, you start to create bond, trust, maybe love, builds relationships off a 5% increase from baseline, right? Next up is music, art, culture, therapy, you know, theater, 15% increase. Small dose, it's there, a few seconds, it's gone, you want it again, you re-engage. This builds our skill sets and our motivation to engage in it again and again. Sports, 25% increase in dopamine. That's about as good as it gets for the human brain for dopamine production. You know, most days we're living in the 5 to 25%. Few second doses, it's gone, we want to re-engage in it, it motivates us to do it again. And so that's what creates who we are, our personalities, right? Now there's one of the intimacy, sex. That's about a 50% increase in dopamine, but it's also endogenous opioids and hormones, and it's a cocktail. And the thing with that is you can't do that anytime, anywhere. It's not like the other natural 5 to 25. It's reserved for those special occasions. And again, so why is that one rewarded so high and the highest? Because if it wasn't rewarded at 50%, we probably wouldn't have engaged in it, and we would have died off as a human species thousands of years ago. So it's rewarded very highly to motivate us to engage in that behavior so that our species can live on, right? So everything is rewarded based on survival, right? Basically, this brain for thousands and thousands of years has learned what keeps us alive, and what allows our species to live on. So things like, you know, high-fat foods, sugars, you know, all those things, you know, sex, you know, instant gratification, those are things we place high on importance, okay? But this brain works. Really, the nucleus accumbens is where this dopamine lands. The hippocampus is our emotional memory. So if I was a 16-year-old young person and I get a hold of some high-grade, or let's just say nicotine for the first time, more than likely I'm going to feel a stimulant effect and I'm going to feel relaxed. I'm going to like it. Nothing bad happens. So the amygdala is our fear factor part of the brain. This is where like fear and anxiety live. So if nothing bad happens, there's no negative emotion about it, right? What you have is the hippocampus, being our memory, remembers that, hey, last time you did that, it felt good and nothing bad happened. So now the hippocampus reaches over to the prefrontal cortex and is like, hey, prefrontal cortex, which is our decision-making part of the brain, should I do this? Prefrontal cortex looks down to the amygdala, goes, hey man, is everything cool down there? Any negative emotions or bad things happen last time we did this? No? Okay, great. Cool, let's go for it. And so now we re-engage in it. And we continue to re-engage in it until something negative happens. And then hopefully that is an enlightening moment for that individual, and perhaps it will motivate them to not do it again. However, if they continue to do it despite the negative emotions, despite the negative consequences, then that person starts to show signs of dependency, and they may have an underlying, maybe family history of substance use, which doesn't mean you're going to end up addicted or in a substance use disorder. It just means that you might be more sensitive. When we look at this model, the brain is a machine. It's a very, very complicated machine, but it works very simply. And it wants to feel good. It wants to get from point A to point B as fast as possible with as minimal energy put out as possible. It wants to conserve energy. And if we engage in things like conversations, music, culture, art, sports, those all take energy and only a little itty bitty reward. And so if that's all we know, that's good enough. But once we start putting in drugs from an external source, that's where the problems lie. And we'll take a look at this. So first we'll look at, I will annotate here. Excuse me, pull this up. So I talked about, conversation. That's about here, that's about that level. And so these are like little blips on the map. It goes up for a few seconds and you're back down to baseline. Baseline is, you always have like maybe 1% floating around. It's what allows you to stay focused in boring situations. If we didn't have baseline dopamine, we'd basically be grouchy all the time, agitated. Some people have low baseline dopamine. So they may feel more agitated, depressed than the average person. That's where, having a discussion with, doctors, and perhaps there's some psychotropic medication that may be appropriate for that individual. Cool. But medical inclusion, trained medical doctors are really important to be part of this. So this is a conversation, a joke, 5% increase, up, down, gone, right? Then there's, music or art or culture, that's about a 15%, but again, just a few seconds, and then it's right back down to baseline. And then there's sports, which is, again, just a quick, you score a touchdown or, you make a goal or whatever, a basket, and it's right back down. Very fast acting. Sex, sex is all the way up here, and it's very fast acting, and then it's gone. So this is kind of where we live naturally. Where's nicotine? Nicotine is interesting because nicotine is this very rapid increase upon inhale or exposure. It enters the blood, it gets to the brain, and it produces right around 15% dopamine. And it doesn't last just a few seconds. It lasts for 15 to 20 minutes, and it slowly goes down back to baseline. And the first time you use nicotine, you'll return to baseline and you'll feel fine. But the more and more you do it, the more you return below baseline. And once you use it regularly, now you're landing below baseline every 15 or 20 minutes wears off after your last dose. And you stay down here until you use nicotine again, which brings you rapidly back up to that point. So when you look at nicotine, right, smokers, if they're not smoking and within the last 15 to 20 minutes, they're grouchy because their baseline dopamine doesn't register, all right? They are in what's called protracted withdrawal for nicotine. They are in low dopamine stage. And this is just nicotine, all right? And this is just 15 minutes. So for a smoker, will a good conversation still work? Well, let's look at that. A good conversation after 15 or 20 minutes, that doesn't start at baseline. That good conversation now has to start at the new baseline for that individual, which means that conversation is now starting from there. So will they feel a slight improved mood from that conversation? Yes, but are they going to feel it the same way as this person? No. And that's the problem with nicotine. All right. So when we look at nicotine, that's basically how it works. Now, when we look at cannabis, and we'll keep these up here so you have a general idea. We will let's find a different color here. Let's go with orange. All right. So when somebody smokes cannabis, they don't stop at the 15%. They don't stop at the 25%. They don't stop at the 50%. It's 100% increase in dopamine, which is off the charts. So I'll just do it up here so you can see it. And it doesn't last for 15 to 20 minutes. It lasts for 45 minutes to 2 hours. All right. And so now all of these things here, conversations, art, culture, sports, intimacy, don't seem so important. How can these compare to that? And with cannabis, when the person does come down And I'll just undo all of this so that we can kind of take a look at it about baseline again here. When they do return to baseline, for the first, for the first several or multiple uses of experimentation, they are going to return to baseline. So if this is like, say, like this is like a 2-hour time frame, this line here, when they use, they're going to go up to that 100%, and then slowly over that 2 hours, they'll return to baseline. All right. But the more they use, the more they end up in the basement. And the more they use, the more they end up in the basement. And that's tolerance. All right. And so, the kind of classic joke with, pot or marijuana is, hippies are always great. They're always happy, unless they run out of pot. And I don't want to sound like, a teetotaler or, like reefer madness guy. Is it probably the least harmful of all, illicit drugs, because it is illegal as a recreational drug here? Yeah, it is. But when you compare what we just looked at, when we look at cannabis compared to natural functioning of the brain, it's still a drug, just like any drug. And it can impact, especially developing adolescent, profoundly. It will result in missed opportunities, lack of identity, regret. And that's why, I always encourage individuals, say, look, wait till you're in your 20s and you can, try it then in a state that it's legal in. And by then, probably you'll have so many positive things instilled that even if you do try it, it's not like you're going to run with it, because you have all these other things that are who you are: sports, art, culture, relationships. That's the important things, right? So theoretically, could it be used responsibly by adults? Yeah, except for that titration piece. It's not like, you can go out and just take a puff and just, be like, oh, hey, I feel loose. No, the pot of today is going to get you really, really high. So with that, medical cannabis. I do not want to take this away from anybody. Does it have potential to help people? Absolutely. There's 23 diagnoses on the Department of Health website where it shows promise for some of them. But I'm not a medical doctor, so I really can't recommend it. All right. Only people who can write scripts for it are medical doctors, and the actual script that the doctors write has nothing about dosage or titration, has nothing about type or strain, or anything else. All that prescription that doctor, who's registered on the state's website in order to be allowed to write a script, says that this person presents for this diagnosis, which is one of the 23 listed on the Department of Health's website. That individual now takes that doctor's script to a dispensary where they meet with a nurse practitioner or another medical doctor who verifies that, explains the process, and then releases that individual into the dispensary, where that person now is introduced to what's called the bud tender. And that bud tender, all they have to do is a week-long class to get certified as a bud tender. And that's the actual terminology. If you Google, how do I become a bud tender in Pennsylvania, you can read about it. You have to have a high school diploma. That's it. And now these bud tenders are giving medical advice to individuals on the dosage, type, potency, and there is a lot of misinformation out there. And so, I like to take my medical advice from somebody who is actually a medical doctor, not somebody who took an internet class for a week and has a high school diploma. Sorry, I don't believe that's medicine. I believe that's for-profit, predatory marketing. And so I would love to see this process morph into the hands of medical licensed facilities. Doctors are the ones who should be having the conversation about titration, dosage, dispensing, all of those things. All right. I don't think it's a perfect model right now. But that's just my opinion. And opinions are like doorknobs. Every door has one. All right. So It's called Act 16. You can read more about that, effects of cannabis on the body. Yeah, it's probably less harmful than most other drugs. It's actually, from what we know, doesn't carry the same carcinogenic effects as nicotine or tobacco, excuse me. It also doesn't necessarily set you up for, heart problems or other health-related issues that are related to nicotine, but it's still not healthy. All right. And the reason why it's not healthy is because it can take away from you what you find pleasure in. And that has what's been linked and is mismarketed as the endocannabinoid system, or the ECS. So retailers and dispensaries love the ECS because it's medical language. It's medical jargon that they can latch onto and say, look, we have endocannabinoid receptor and the endocannabinoid system. We have cannabinoid receptors in the brain and throughout the body. We're supposed to be using this, except it's not really called the endocannabinoid system. It was coined that in the 70s. Up until the 70s, it was recognized as the anandamide system, which is consists of what we now call CB1 and CB2. But this has been known for quite some time that anandamide is the mood enhancer. It modulates and regulates the dopamine transmission between sending and receiving cells. And once researchers discovered that cannabis has the ability to hijack this system, they started calling it the endocannabinoid system, endo meaning from within. And unfortunately, I believe that has done more damage than anything else to lower the perceived level of harm about cannabis. Hey, if it's natural, if it's, if we have a system in our body called cannabinoid, we should use it. No, it was never been called that. It was called the anandamide system. And the anandamide system responds to both CBDs and THCs. THC is what gets you high, euphoric. CBDs are what has a lot of the medicinal value. Now, THC also has medicinal value, especially for chronic pain, all right? So, depending on, your of your diagnosis, you may want something higher in THC and lower in CBD content, all right? But if you're looking at using a cannabis product for anxiety, THC is counterproductive. You should not use any THC-based substance for anxiety disorders. It's counterproductive because it hijacks your actual regulatory system of mood, all right? CBD shows some promise for anxiety, but that doesn't make you feel high. See, CBDs latch on to the anandamide or the CB1 and CB2 receptors, and it actually blocks THC's ability to get you high. It's kind of a blocker. All right. So if you log on to any of the dispensary websites, throughout Bucks County or Montgomery County, and you go to the menu option, you'll see probably 90% of their product is high in THC and very low CBD. And when I say very low, I'm talking 0 or 1% CBD, because most people aren't buying CBD product. They're buying the THC product. And I find it hard to imagine that every client is experiencing pain. All right, so can it help people? Absolutely. Risk, benefit. Does the benefit outweigh the risk? And if so, consult the medical team. But I would do so with great caution. So there's a lot of misinformation. CBD that you can buy over the counter at 7-Eleven, that doesn't come from the sensimelia plant, or what we know as cannabis sativa or cannabis indica. There's no regulatory implementations for it. It can be it could be olive oil that you're smoking or absorbing in pill form if it's over the counter. But traditionally, that over the counter CBD oil comes from the hemp plant. And the hemp plant CBD does not have the same medicinal properties that the psychoactive big brother, the cannabis sativa and indica, have. So the over-the-counter stuff that's just sold at like 7-Eleven or the local bike shop, it's snake oil. Somebody's making money and you're not actually getting any response from it. How does cannabis affect the body? Well, upregulation and downregulation. And what that means is that basically, you have sensitivity of brain cells. One cell is sending out a signal to another one. If that cell is sending out a certain amount, and I'll just try and draw this where I want to be cognizant of the time. This is a receiving cell. This is a sending cell. On the surface of the receiving cell, you have lots and lots of receptor sites. All right, these are like dendrites on the cells, and in this sending cell, we have this thing called vesicles, where there's lots of little dopamine molecules in it. And when you engage in something that requires skill and effort, it releases out a couple of these molecules, and some of these molecules will now willy-nilly land somewhere on here on the receiving cell. And when they land in a receptor site, you get a euphoric feeling. You get improved mood, you get happiness, right? But the thing is these don't have any GPS. They go wherever they want. And so this surface of this receiving cell has to be covered in receptor sites. When you use cannabis, it's 100% increase in dopamine. So now you have all of these extra molecules, dopamine and neurotransmitters flooding it that are now going to land in other sites on the surface, and now you feel high, not just happy. Now this receiving cell here goes, whoa, I'm working way too hard. I don't need all this dopamine. I am going to lose or reabsorb some of these receptor sites because I don't need them all. I don't need all those receptor sites. There's plenty of dopamine. All I need are a couple on the surface of my cell, because the more receptor sites that I have, the harder I'm going to work, and I need to conserve energy. So now when the person who is using the cannabis or other drugs doesn't smoke or doesn't use their drug of choice, right? Now they are not getting the mass number of dopamine molecules in the synapse or the space between the cells, and just the couple ones that are manufactured by things that you engage in that require skill and effort may land in the blank space. And now you don't feel that feeling that you once felt when you engaged in those activities. And that motivates the individual to use their drug again so that they can have enough dopamine in here that the likelihood of them filling the limited receptor sites will happen. And that's where it starts. Now, the good news is that with abstinence from using the substance, there's something called upregulation, where these receptor sites grow back onto the surface of the cell. But that can take weeks, months, years, depending on the usage of that person and the history of use. So that's upregulation, downregulation, and that's basically tolerance. The more you use, the less you're going to feel of your natural drugs, and the more dependent you're going to become on external drugs. And now nicotine is really interesting in the fact that it works similarly, but actually in the reverse. So with nicotinoid receptors, they only have a limited number of receptor sites because they recognize that, oh, hey, nicotine is kind of this rare substance, and we don't really need a lot of it. Now, when you use nicotine, what happens is you release these dopamine. The dopamine is released after the nicotine molecule finds these receptor sites. But once you stimulate these receptor sites with nicotine, now the receiving cell actually grows more receptor sites for nicotine, and that creates the craving. So nicotine works kind of reverse of all other drugs. You want downregulation of nicotine and nicotinoid receptors. So that's the problem with nicotine. And when you look at people who smoke, who use nicotine and cannabis at the same time, you can imagine how hard that's going to be to treat that individual, because now you're having to consider upregulation, downregulation. This drug does this drug does that. Where am I, right? So when we look at that hopefully that is a little easier to understand if you've heard those terms. All right, let's move on here. So nicotine is also a stimulant. It increases heart rate, it increases blood pressure at the same time. And it brings it to very unnatural rates, and it keeps it there for 15 to 20 minutes at a time. At the same time, it constricts arteries, strips a protective fat lining off of your arterial walls, so that now unhealthy saturated fats adhere to your arterial walls. It's also a tumor enhancer, which means it doesn't cause cancer, but actually nicotine takes away the cell's ability to enter something called apoptosis, or programmed cellular death, which means if there's a mutation in a cell, which happens all the time, mutations occur, right? That's okay though, because our cells have this self-defense mechanism called lysosomes. And if the cell recognizes that there's a mutation there, it tries to fix it. If it can't fix it, it enters self-destruct. It goes poof, and self-destructs, apoptosis. So no worries, right? Nicotine takes away the cell's ability to self-destruct. And so that now that cell that can't fix the mutation divides into 2 cells with mutations, and those divide into 4 cells. And those cells cannot self-destruct. And so it's not a carcinogen, but it allows tumors to grow exponentially. And it also increases blood flow to those tumors, making them grow faster and more aggressively. Nicotine versus exercise. Exercise is increased blood pressure, increased heart rate for a few seconds at a time. It's this constant equilibrium. It's transient. You'll hear people say, well, nicotine does the same thing as exercise. No, it doesn't. Nicotine increases your heart rate, your blood pressure, and keeps it there for 20 to 30 minutes at a time. It constricts arteries. It does all the things I talked about. It essentially gives you high blood pressure. So the disease of high blood pressure, if you're a smoker, if you're a teenager with no history of high blood pressure and you start smoking, you are now giving yourself high blood pressure. All right. And so most smokers who most smokers, they don't die from cancer. They die from cardiovascular disease. Everybody thinks smokers die from cancer. No. Most smokers die from cardiovascular disease because of this very reason. Increased heart rate, increased blood pressure for the entire time that you're smoking. So chain smokers, elevated heart rate, blood pressure, constricted arteries throughout the whole day. Right? That was kind of an anomaly back in the day. Now we're seeing teenagers who are vapors essentially using record amounts of nicotine. Yeah, Kim.
There's a question for you. Where in the brain are the receptors located? Is there a specific part of the brain, or are they everywhere?
Nicotinoid receptors, well, I mean, the ones that I'm referring to are primarily in the limbic system, but we do have receptors throughout the gut and muscle tissue and immune system. But the ones I'm referring to are in this pleasure center of the brain.
Thanks.
And then marketing, misinformation. Co-founder James Moans has stated that chemically nicotine is very similar to caffeine. Coffee is one of the most widely traded products in the world. While people of all ages around the world enjoy coffee, nicotine has been heavily stigmatized. No, nicotine is nothing like coffee. Nicotine raises heart rate, blood pressure. It puts people in agitated states. It lasts for 2 hours. It is a tumor enhancer. The only thing caffeine does is it blocks a drug called adenosine. Adenosine is a neurotransmitter which makes us tired. Right? So caffeine blocks that drug. That's all it does. It doesn't raise heart rate. Slight increase in blood pressure, but only if you have a pre-existing condition and only if you're using past that the recommended milligrams. Doctors say about 400 milligrams are considered acceptable and safe. To give you an estimate of that, kind of a barometer of that, 1 Red Bull can is about 80 milligrams. So you'd have to be, cranking down like 5 or 6 Red Bull cans a day to get to a point where it would become a health issue. All right. So nicotine and caffeine, not at all similar, but it's this misinformation that young people are getting. And so now with vaping, I told you when we had we had smoking sections, you had to go outside to smoke. So that limited the amount of time that you could use nicotine. Now, vaping can be done anywhere, anytime. Micro hitting, small puff. You don't even need to exhale because it's vapor. It's not smoke. You can just, so now youth who are very sensitive to nicotine are recognizing that it improves my focus, improves my mood, and it's the healthy alternative to smoking. So now they are micro hitting throughout the day, and from the waking moment to the sleeping moment, elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, constricted artery, tumor enhancing effects. I'm afraid that this generation we're going to see a profound number of 20s and 30-year-olds with cardiovascular disease, more than we've ever seen before, because no previous generation has used nicotine at this level. Not smoking, nicotine. And where we're seeing where the really big jump is college age. High schoolers are using it a lot, but college is even higher report. Why? Autonomy. They're able to make their own decisions. And all of the research shows that today's vapors are tomorrow's smokers. Because once they discover that a cigarette, that freebasing of that tobacco leaf at the end of a cigarette, that gives them a larger head rush than any vaping device ever has. Yes, Kim?
Question for you. Does nicotine that you put under your tongue cause vascular issues with heart disease?
Yes, absolutely. So tinctures. Yep, it's a stimulant, whether it's orally ingested, mucosally absorbed, heated and inhaled. It does the same exact thing. Nicotine replacement therapies, patch, gum, lozenges. Are they safe? No, it's nicotine. It does all of the same things. The idea is by using these NRT, which are FDA approved, you're eliminating the tar, the carcinogens, the smoke, the heat, all of those things. And now you have a plan for that individual to taper down the dosage over the period of 2 to 3, 4 months until they no longer need that nicotine, and now they're nicotine free. So it's risk and benefit. The benefit of continuing to give them safer form of nicotine outweighs the risk of them continuing to smoke, but it is not safe. It is not healthy. It's nowhere even beginning to be anywhere near safe. And this is the misinformation that we're being told in order to profit. We call them electronic nicotine delivery systems. And this is the vape devices, whether it's the Dual, the Caliburn, the UL, which we'll see some pictures of here in a minute. The 5 ideas about these are they're less harmful than traditional smoking. Yeah, they're less harmful because they don't have the tar, the carcinogens, but they're harmful. All right, and they're equally addictive to cigarettes, and today's vapors are tomorrow's smokers. Can they be used as a cessation aid, quitting aid? Yeah, not FDA approved. I would encourage an individual to use gum, lozenge, patches, a combination of, in order to achieve, the same result. Because my concern is that vaping for many people becomes a replacement, not a cessation aid. And the replacement, is it less harmful than smoking? Yeah, it's harm reduction, but it's still harmful. And that person is still going to have a high risk of cardiovascular disease because they're using nicotine. I mentioned it's not vapor, it's actually aerosol, which is particulate matter suspended in a water molecule, which you inhale. And we have these things in our lungs called macrophages, which are like little Pac-Men. If you can imagine a Pac-Man running around in your lungs, eating up all the dust and pollen, all the things that we inhale throughout the day, it gets rid of it, right? And then there's also macrophages which fight off viruses. When we smoke, when we vape, it overwhelms those things. So now we have chronically irritated lungs and suppressed immune system. With the COVID-19, that is a concern, all right? Now what we're seeing is a lot of misinformation. Vegetable glycerin, propylene glycol, flavorings, doesn't matter. They're all FDA approved. They are. They're FDA approved, Food and Drug Administration approved, but they're not approved for vaping. They're approved for ingestion, for food and food only. Ingestion, digestion, and evacuation. They've never been approved for heating and inhalation. So again, the industry is using misinformation. They're taking claims and they're using the claims for off-label devices and uses. Vegetable glycerin and propylene glycol overwhelm. This is the suspension that the flavorings and nicotine is suspended in. They overwhelm the macrophages, and we don't know what they do to the lung tissue in the long term because we don't have any longitudinal studies. We do know it at least chronically inflames the lung tissue. The e-cigarettes started with one that looked like a cigarette. Didn't catch on because it looked like you were still smoking. People who wanted to quit smoking didn't still want to be labeled as a smoker. So these didn't really catch on. The hookah pens, these are more modifiable. You can personalize them. You can regulate how much nicotine you have, what flavor, what juice, what flavor, propylene glycol versus vegetable glycerin. These were clunky. They leaked. They overheated. They even blew up sometimes. So we started seeing more specialized product, not only for nicotine products, but also for cannabis vaping or cannabis use. But marketing, it's marketing these very sleek, easy to use, oftentimes disposable items. Other ones are going to be refillable, like these. These are, you can put your own mixture in there, and yes, you can mix e-juice with hash oil or cannabis oil, so that now you get the stimulant effect of nicotine as well as the euphoric effect of cannabis, and you can mix them, and it doesn't smell. If you're using like strawberry e-juice and you put some hash oil in there, it's going to smell like strawberry e-juice. So these devices are becoming very popular. However, you still cannot beat these. I don't know what happened there. Nope, I don't want that. All right. Interesting. Okay. Bear with me here. All right. I must have hit something. You cannot beat these mass-produced, very sleek, very discreet. Some of these are refillable, some of them are cartridge system, but these you can put in the palm of your hand, take a micro hit, and use it all day long, and it looks like a lighter or something very discreet. Young people who are trying to get over on individuals are not going to be using those kind of mods. They'll have those maybe in the bedroom for later use, but when they're out in the public, they're carrying these. Particularly the UL Caliburn is a popular one. The Juul is immensely popular because these, you can actually take that little black cap off the top, dump some of the e-juice out, dump some hash oil in, and put it together, and now you can hit your nicotine e-juice combined with hash oil, and it smells like mango. And if you're busted, you're going to get busted for having e-juice. Nobody's going to open this up and test the substance for hash oil. Even the resource officers say we just don't simply have the resources to do that. And so if a young person is using cannabis out in the public or in settings, they're usually going to be using it in stealthy items like these. They're not going to be carrying a bowl or a joint or rolling papers in a bag of weed because that is easy to get caught with. This is discreet, and more than likely they won't get caught with it. So why are youth using so much? And most kids don't use, actually. So most of the kids are using their brain and engaging in healthy, pro-social healthy things. But for the 30 to 40% of the other youth who are actively using drugs, why are they doing so? Because perceived level of harm is low. Anytime perceived level of harm is low, use rises. And if they're going to be using a cannabis product, it's going to be a hash oil product, I guarantee it. Yes, they would prefer to smoke it, but that's usually done when they're away from prying eyes in, controlled environments where they know they're not going to get caught. But if they're out at social functionings and things like this, they're going to be using a hash oil. Problem with that is most of the hash oil that's out there in Pennsylvania are what's called BHO, butane hash oil extraction, which they use lighter fluid to extract THC from the pot plant. And no matter how much they try to purge that THC, that product, they will never get rid of all of the heavy metals, neurotoxins, and carcinogens that are in butane. So there's going to be residual leftovers in that product. And with chronic exposure to this, we don't have any longitudinal study. We do know that butane is a very potent neurotoxin, and with chronic exposure, butane can result in brain lesions. So if there's contaminants in the product, what's chronic use? Daily use, weekly use? Also, heating butane or hash oil. Some of these methods, they get the temperatures of the device well above 1,000 degrees. When this happens, methacrylene is a off-gas product, which is similar to acrolein, which is a pulmonary irritant, which causes lung injury and pulmonary edema in laboratory animals, all right? So cannabis is not this perfectly safe substance. It's not what we grew up with. The stuff that we grew up with, and I'm going to skip ahead because I want to be respectful of time. These couple slides just talk on adulterants. So for a while there, you were hearing about lung injury cases. It's because if you look at this oil, it's dark and thick, and drug dealers like to buy in bulk and thin it down. And if you thin it down, it's not dark and thick. They discovered that vitamin E acetate, you can cut hash oil with this, and it stays thick and dark. And now it can be sold as high quality hash oil, except it's not hash oil. Vitamin E acetate, which essentially drowns. Remember those macrophages in our lungs? It essentially drowns those because it's an oil. So that's what we were seeing a lot of our lung injury cases from. But when we look at cannabis from when I was a young person, in the 80s, in high school, 3.5% THC. In 2016, average was 17%. Now the average varies from 15 to 30% for flowering material, with most on the high end of that 27-30% THC. And with hash oil products such as shatter, crumble, or oil, you're talking 80 or 90% pure THC. 80 or 90% pure versus 3%. It's not the same drug. There's no titration able to be accomplished. So if you think back to the 80s and you were somebody who maybe smoked a joint with 5 friends and you caught a little buzz and you laughed it off for 15 minutes, that was called titration. You were able to titrate that low potency pot. Not today's. This was pot of yesteryear. Brickweed, stems, seeds, very low. This is pot of today. Very high potency. All those little white crystals on there, that's the THC. You actually see it. It's called trichomes. All right. These are just some other trends. Moon rocks. Snoop Dogg, who's like kind of great musician, love the guy, but he's kind of like the connoisseur of like pot, pot smoking. Even he says, don't smoke the moon rocks unless you are a veteran pot smoker and you're around somebody who can help you if you need help. And, this is how potent pot is, all right, nowadays. It's not the same thing. It's not the same. Some other forms, bubble hash, tinctures. You don't really see these tinctures, sublingual administration, same thing. High potency, enters the bloodstream. Now, anytime you bypass, the safety system of like either smoking, you don't know the outcome. So tinctures can last long, hour to 2 hours to 3 hours. Ingestion, it takes probably an hour for it to go through first and second pass metabolization. And during that time, you think you didn't eat enough, now you eat more. And then by the time it plays catch up, now you're committed to a 4 or 5, 6 hour high that is more intense than smoking. But smoking comes in many different forms. You have dabs, oil rigs. You need to use a blowtorch with an oil rig. You have traditional bongs. You have hot knives. So if you open your kitchen drawer and you have teenagers in your house and you see the tips of some butter knives that are black, more than likely that is because somebody in your house is hot knifing, which means you heat up the knives on the burner, and then you take like a, how do I say this, like maybe a booger-sized piece of hash or rolled up pot, and now you take those 2 glowing red knives and you squeeze it together. And if you look down at the right-hand corner of this slide, you see this young man with a bottle that with the bottom cut off of the bottle with the bottom cut off. Now he holds that and he sucks the smoke up through the bottle, and you get like a super potent hit. It's essentially vaporization of that substance through very high temperature, which delivers a very potent hit. So there's lots of ways to smoke this. Of course, there's that timeless gas mask. I think every generation, everybody knew somebody in high school who had the gas mask that was turned into the bong. Smoking joints has not gone out of fashion. It's just considered risky. If you're trying to be discreet, you're not going to be carrying around, some easy wide or, big bamboo papers and, some pot because you're going to get caught. So again, that vaping is the preferred method. So if you find a jewel pod on your kid and you're like, okay, well, at least it's just nicotine, take it apart, pull that little pod out. And if it's not clear, if it looks dark, like a dark tan or even a black, that's not e-juice, that's hash oil. All right. So, some resources for schools. There's lots of good programs. I think Catch My Breath is probably the best one out there. It's free. You can go on their website. Parents, you can watch this for free at home on your computer, and it's a great resource for you. Cessation options for nicotine. Only use FDA approved products, and that means gum, lozenges, which are both short acting for those short cravings, in combination with patches, which are long acting. Sometimes for some people, it's a combination of all three. Some people just the patch alone. Some people don't need the patch, they only need the short acting. But you need to get with a certified tobacco treatment specialist or a medical doctor to find out which is best for that individual. Some resources for quitting tobacco or nicotine products. And all right, so some questions. Kim, you want to have these addressed?
Sure. I think let's start with one that was just asked live. The person asked if this was addressed, and I don't think it has been yet. What is your view, Dave, on the theory that marijuana is or is not a gateway drug?
Yeah, no, it's a gateway drug. Have no mistake about that. The way that, remember, we live in that 5 to 25% increase in dopamine from day in and day out. Small dose, short acting, motivates us to engage in things, right? That are positive, pro-social, result in healthy, positive recognition from peers and parents. Cannabis, just pot. 100% increase in dopamine. So it's 4 times the potency of sports. It lasts for 45 minutes to 2 hours, and it takes no skill and no effort. The brain is going to remember that. And the problem with that is today's cannabis is so potent that youth are building a tolerance on a substance that is not just getting them high, but it's getting them really, really high. And I cannot stress this enough. This is not just an old man who is, spewing reefer madness stuff. Hey, I experimented in the 80s. I got lucky. I was one of those people who didn't end up with a substance use disorder. I got lucky. What can I say? Unfortunately, many people who I knew did not get so lucky. All right. Now, if I grew up now and I had exposure to what is out there now, I don't know if I would have turned out the same way, because it's not the same substance. And the risk for dependency is real, and cannabis dependency is real. And the problem with cannabis dependency is, you're not going to knock over a 7-Eleven for it. You're not going to sell yourself on a street corner for it. You're not going to, go through horrible, long-lasting withdrawal if you go cold turkey on it. You don't need to taper off of it if you're trying to quit it. But what it does is it takes away from you who you are, what you're capable of, what you're passionate about. It robs you of pride, integrity, and motivation. And that's what drugs do. It's just some drugs do it more effectively and more outwardly. All right. So is it a gateway drug? Absolutely for some. Others, it may be their only drug. So gateway, what does that mean? Does it mean that if you smoke pot, you're going to shoot dope? No. But do you really want to smoke pot for your whole life and use that as your coping mechanism for anxiety, stress, celebratory opportunities, happiness, wellness? That's a substance use disorder, especially when it begins to interfere with your life.
And I think it could be said too that if we're talking about adolescence, which is really what our focus is here, any substance can be a gateway to some to use, because if you're introducing, as you pointed out, it's not just cannabis that really shoots up the dopamine. It can be alcohol, it can be nicotine, it can be, well, you mostly talked about nicotine, but any of these things can lead to dependence, which can lead to an addiction, which can lead to other drug use. So, almost anything. I mean, I would even argue that, addiction to technology could be a gateway to, okay, now this isn't filling that hole that I had anymore. Now I need something else. I need something else that's going to take me away, because, our tolerance builds with certain substances, and then there needs to be more or something else or something different. And, and as you said, it's not going to happen to everybody, but it's going to happen to somebody who maybe has some other genetic predisposition, a mental health challenge, something like that. Yeah.
And I like to call them drugs of association. If you surround yourself with a group of 20 people, and maybe, 4 people come into that group with some weed, and they're like, hey, I got some weed, who wants to smoke? Maybe, half of that group will walk away and be like, yeah, no, I'm good, thanks. The remainder of that group smoke, right? And they party, and they're like, it's just weed, it's cool. And then somebody else comes in, and they're like, hey, I got some coke. And people are like, oh, hey, I draw my line at weed, I'm not doing that coke. So maybe like 7 of the 10 remaining people break away from that. And now all they do is they just smoke, right? They just smoke weed. They're not cokeheads. And now that remaining 3 people, then somebody brings in some heroin, and maybe, that other person, one of the 3 walks away, is like, no, man, that's where I draw my line. And then it's just 2 left who are now using heroin. So it's a lot of times drugs of association. It's who you surround yourself with. It's surround yourself with positive people, positive things, and have lots of fun, but healthy pro-social fun that you're not going to regret. That leads fun that results in positive peer and parental recognition, that results in pride, integrity, things you'll look back on 10 years from now and be like, I'm so glad I did that. Not, oh yeah, I really don't want to talk about that. So, gateway drugs, the terminology, yeah, I get that, but I like to call them drugs of association. And then, Kim, you brought up the genetic aspect of it. Genetics do play a role, but it's not a death sentence. It's kind of like if 2 amazing violinists had a child, right? That child at 13 decides to start playing violin. Are they going to be an amazing violinist? No. They just happen to have a protein on a strain of DNA or, somewhere that in practice, it lights up, and they're going to accelerate. They're going to be better at the violin than somebody who doesn't have that genetic predisposition, but it takes practice. It's not something that happens overnight. And so with repeated use, repeated exposure, they're more likely to end up with a substance use disorder than somebody whose parents don't have the history of substance use. So genetics does play a role, but it's not like 100%, it doesn't mean that you're going to end up addicted to something.
Right, sure. So a couple of the questions that came in ahead of time, and we don't have any more live ones, so please, folks, if you have any questions for Dave, type them into Q&A or chat now. But some questions that were asked ahead of time were about signs and symptoms, how someone can know that a person is vaping, and same for parents and teachers looking for signs, vaping and or using THC.
Yeah. So vaping nicotine is very difficult because it is so stealthy. I would look, if they're living in our house, they, really, they don't have privacy. They have privacy that we allow them, but we have the right to search and to ask them to empty their pockets if we have a suspicion. My mom used to give me the hug, not because she loved me, because she was smelling. So if you smell mango or razzmatazz or watermelon or something that just doesn't smell right, go with your gut, right? Keep an eye on things. Increased agitation, moodiness, easily frustrated, loss of interest in things that they once engaged in that meant something to them. They disappear out in the garage or out in the backyard, in more times than they used to now in order to vape. Those are some things to keep an eye on. Cannabis is going to be more in your face, and you're going to see the more of the mood swings. Of course, you're going to see the increase of loss of interest, things that they once used to love doing. So if your son or daughter was into skateboarding or softball or something like that, and they really loved it, and then they started hanging around with a different group of people, and then they lost interest in those things, and now they don't seem to do anything except hang out with their friends, and they seem maybe depressed or sad or agitated when you question them about it, that could be a warning sign, all right, or a symptom of substance use. So I always tell parents, go with your gut. Your gut is usually right. And then, of course, urine drug screens. Urine drug screens are very effective. You can use both urine drug screens as well as oral swabs. Oral swabs usually detect the last 24 to 48 hour use of a substance, where urine drug screens usually detect last 30-day use. But with urine drug screens, you're not going to really get the last 24, 48 hour window, because what urine drug screens test for are metabolites. So, like, let's say somebody smokes a bunch of pot on a Saturday night, and they haven't smoked pot in years. They go into their employer on Monday, and they're handed a slip to go take a urine drug screen. More than likely, they're going to pass, because the body hasn't had time to break down all of that cannabis into what's called metabolites, which those urine drug screens look for, all right? Now, if it's an oral swab, the oral swabs only detect the last 24 to 48 hours. They don't go back further than that. So if you're a parent, I would say, if you have a young person who you're struggling with as far as honesty about use the oral swab and the urine drug screen, because if you give them the urine drug screen, they can say, oh, well, it's positive because I used like 3 weeks ago. That was the last time I used. So then you can follow up and be like, all right, well, here's an oral swab. Go ahead and swab this. And if that comes up positive, that means they used within the last 48 hours.
Right.
And most importantly, with home tests, get to our website, get to the Bucks County Drug and Alcohol Commission or the Montgomery County Drug and Alcohol Commission and download their home testing guide. Have a plan, because if it comes up positive and you don't have a plan, you're going to, it's not going to be great. So before you pop those things, have a plan, have somebody lined up where you're going to bring them in for an assessment or meet with a counselor to discuss this problem.
Absolutely. I would also add finding Visine bottles all over the house, even when it's not allergy season, is a really good indication. Also, sleep patterns can change quite a bit. Weight, different things like that. More isolation, just some of those kinds of things are also indicators. And if, by the way, if they refuse to take a urine screen, you kind of have your answer.
Yes.
Why would you refuse if you were not going to test positive? So.
Yep.
So I really want to get to this question too. It was asked actually live and ahead of time. One question that came in early was, my son started smoking cigarettes, nicotine, at the rehabilitation center. Why do they encourage that? And also just asked in that same vein, many addicts in recovery settle into a reliance on nicotine. Any thoughts on how long after recovery from drug and alcohol addiction should the reliance on nicotine be addressed?
Realistically, all outcomes, the outcomes that we have, long-term recovery is attainable, is more attainable for those who quit smoking along with their drug of choice in recovery. So if somebody goes into detox for opiate use disorders, and they get to their inpatient facility, what we are recommending is that if they are a smoker, they also quit smoking or vaping or nicotine use, because the nicotine is actually counterproductive. Again, you are relying on a substance that increases dopamine to relatively in the natural levels, but it lasts for 15 and 20 minutes at a time. It doesn't require any skill or effort, and so it is maladapted coping mechanisms which interfere with that person's ability to engage in treatment. And the brain is very interesting. The brain we always want things that are instant gratification, right? So like we love brownies, you know, we love salty potato chips, we love sugar, you know, we dislike asparagus and Brussels sprouts, right? Like that stuff is just like, we eat that because we tell ourselves it's healthy. But what do we really want? We want all of the stuff that is not necessarily that healthy for us, right? Cigarettes are the same way. And so cigarettes, actually, I guess chocolate and salt and sugar actually have a good side. If we were living thousands of years ago and we needed energy to get through the day, cigarettes have never had a place, but cigarettes are the same thing. It's programming this brain to want something that we know we shouldn't be using, and it results in instant gratification, and it interferes with the brain learning to cope with anxiety or the underlying issues that need to be addressed in therapy or counseling. So, I've never heard of a facility that, you know, I think the question was asked, and why did they recommend it? Is that what the question was, Kim? Or why?
Started smoking cigarettes at a rehab center. Why do they encourage that?
Why do they encourage that, right? Honestly, I've never had communication with a provider or a treatment facility that encourages smoking. I think a lot of facilities are against going smoke-free because they look at it as they may be losing clients because clients may not be willing to engage in their facility if they have to quit smoking. But actually, that's been shown to be false. All right. All of the data shows that individuals are going into treatment despite it being, whether it's smoke-free or smoke allowed. So smoke-free does not deter individuals from seeking treatment. It's more of where that individual is at the levels of change. Are they in that planning and action stage? And if they are, most are able to recognize that, yes, I probably should quit smoking too. And all of the outcome data that we have shows that successes are higher for those who quit smoking while in treatment for a substance use disorder. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the direction where this, you know, the providers are going now. It's just a matter of time before all are smoke-free. And I think that's good, because, you know, you're slowing the process of allowing the brain to say heal, right? These connections, that down regulation and up regulation of those cells needs to heal. It needs to get back to normal. And nicotine just hinders it and slows the healing process.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so very much, Dave. I want to wrap up here because we're actually a little past 8:30. So thank you. Really appreciate it. We will be, we'll be getting prompted to complete a survey at the end of this. So we hope that you'll fill that out. And once this is processed, the video will be loaded up onto our YouTube page and that follow-up page that I shared with you earlier, conversation.zone/vaping. It's also in the chat box. Dave, thank you again. You're a wealth of information. We're really grateful to have you here. So
thanks so much, Kim. Enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.